Again, it's a 100-page report. It's available on the DEM's website, but you can see a noticeable impact from the highway for the things that they were measuring. So particle counts, the invisible small particles in the air that travel deeper into the lungs and into the bloodstream. Black carbon, which is associated with diesel. So black carbon in itself isn't the harmful effect, but it's a marker for diesel, and diesel is a carcinogen when it's burned. It causes respiratory effects and a whole number of other factors. And then in the bottom here are benzene and 1,3-butadiene, which are air toxics that are carcinogens. And so you can see that the monitors, and this wasn't an assessment of the port itself, but we can apply some of it to the port because of where the monitors were placed. These ones here, the Bay Street is basically across the highway from the large pile of scrap metal at Sims. And then this one here is the Providence Health Center location, which is right by the Thurbers Ave on-ramp. So again, there's more data there, and there's more work that needs to be done to do a similar type of study around the port, which is a bit more complicated. There's a lot more sources, a lot more area, complicated weather patterns and dynamics, but this is the start of something we can look at. This is asthma data from the Department of Health for children who are enrolled in Medicaid. The area in Upper South Providence and Lower South Providence has the highest rate of asthma emergency department visits for children in Medicaid. It's 3.5 per 100. So for every 100 children in Medicaid in the area, there are 3.5 emergency department visits for asthma within the time period that we looked at. Then we can look at some of the data available for actual shipping and transportation data. So this is from publicly available data from Marine Traffic. It's an app that you can download. And it's almost a 2-year period. It's from January 2018 to November 2019, looking at the types of ships that came into the Port of Providence. So 40% were oil or chemical tankers, 30% were bulk carriers, which can be any number of different bulk things that they would carry. 9% were asphalt bitumen tankers, which are the hot liquid asphalt. Some were vehicle carriers, then cement, oil products, etc. But obviously fossil fuels are the main product that coming in. Then we can look at those same ships and where do they dock. So these are the locations of the different kind of facilities where they docked and the type of commodity that they have there. So you can use this then to see kind of where are the impacts of this, because when a ship is docking, you have both the kind of emissions from the ship while it's there docking. You have the emissions from the cargo handling equipment as it's unloading and offloading the material. And then the emissions related to the transportation in and out of the port. So this can be used to start to piece together those emissions inventories. And then finally, this is my second to last slide here. This is a draft community chemical inventory. So this is a model coming out of New York City and the EJ groups there, looking at the transportation of hazardous materials through communities or the storage of hazardous materials, especially as it comes in for emergency response and helping communities plan for what to do. So most of the time it's emergency responders who deal with that, and that's really important too. But we've seen in the past couple of years a number of different transportation-related accidents in the port area. So the picture on the right here is the ethanol train that derailed onto Allens Ave. The two pictures on the bottom right are when a gasoline tanker that was leaving the Shell facility overturned on the on-ramp and the gasoline poured down onto Allens Ave. There's other ones involving the pipeline rupture further up Allens Ave. And so these were all pictures that I took. When you see those little diamond placards on the side of either a ship or a truck, or usually not ships, it's usually trucks or trains. These are a universal code for identifying hazardous substances that are in it being transported that are used for emergency responders. You look at the environmental effects, the health effects, what to do. And so the train that's in the middle there is carrying chlorine, which is an inhalation hazard. If that were to rupture, you'd have to have set up boundaries of 1,000 feet or up to a half mile or larger, depending on the size of the spill. And so these are things that are important for communities and first responders to know about. So based on just what I've observed kind of coming in out of the port over the past 2 years, this is an initial draft of a community chemical inventory of what the chemical is, what the placard number is, what type of hazard classification it then has. You can look them up online and it'll tell you this is flammable gas, flammable liquid, poisonous gas, corrosive, and oxidizer. So different types of things react differently. what the potential health risks of exposure could be, where it's located, and how it's usually transported. So EJ groups in New York City are working with RAND Corporation on using this information, kind of prioritizing what communities are most concerned about, and putting environmental monitoring systems in place now, because once a disaster happens, you know, a hurricane hits, an incident happens, it's too late to set up monitoring systems at that point. You need to have them in place ahead of time and have people trained about them so that when something like that happens, you can answer people's questions like, when is it safe to go back to my home? You know, if there's flooding, what could be in the water? If there's an incident at a facility, what are the potential things I should be aware of? So these are kind of real-time decisions that can be used to inform both governments and communities about how to respond, and it's part of climate resilience and preparedness. So, covered a lot. That quick summary wasn't quite so quick, but just in conclusion, I think around policy needs around this, like I said, I wasn't really coming to any conclusions in this. I was really presenting kind of what's out there, what have other communities done, what are the gaps, what could be done here. And to summarize kind of what would rise to the top, I think, you know, recommendations could be around the need for kind of enhanced enforcement of existing laws and regulations. There's things like our no idling law that are in place that already, you know, laws have been passed, they're just not enforced. And so you have the no idling signs and trucks idling literally right next to them, as you can see in the picture here. There is a need for more air monitoring and emissions reductions at the port. We won't know if we're actually reducing emissions if we don't have the systems in place to track those emissions, to monitor them, to set goals and targets, and to work on that. And we don't have those systems currently. Like I mentioned before, we don't have a port governance structure. There's no port authority, there's no real structure. We have some good community engagement, we have some good interagency communication, but there's no structure around that. And so creating a structure that has community involvement, that kind of does this comprehensively, could benefit and be a kind of single institution to coordinate between all these different places. When we're looking at transportation planning, we need to make sure that we have comprehensive transportation planning for climate justice. So it's not just about you know, traffic on the highway, it's not just about bike and pedestrian infrastructure. Those are important pieces of it. We need to be looking at kind of safety for bicyclists and pedestrians along Allens Ave. But we also need to include freight transportation planning within climate goals. Right now, the state's freight transportation plan doesn't really mesh with the state's climate goals in terms of if you connect them together. So looking at kind of a more coordinated future planning. Another gap is around cumulative impacts. This is a big topic in the environmental justice community around the country, both at the state level and the municipal and local level. Our regulatory system looks at things kind of facility by facility, or you know, pollutant by pollutant, and regulates them individually, and doesn't look at the cumulative impacts, especially when you have environmental justice issues with many different facilities, many different medium, many different types of operations in one small location. So being able to look at cumulative impacts, there are some tools that have been developed in other states, ordinances that have been passed at the city level that could be replicated in Providence. And then finally, looking at community resilience and emergency preparedness in a deeply kind of community engaged level, thinking about the health impacts of climate impacts, whether it's from hurricanes, storm surges in the port area, not just in terms of helping the port industries get back up on their feet and prepare and respond, but the impact on the community around it, and the kind of community chemical inventory. What do people need to know? The sirens consistently malfunction. There's no real communication around, you know, a chlorine gas release is very different than an anhydrous ammonia release is very different than a gasoline spill in terms of what kinds of things people need to do to respond and protect themselves and their family. And then also thinking about asthma, heat, all the other kind of health effects related to climate change. All right. How
Awesome.
about,
That was perfect.